Okay, so you join me 19 minutes into this flight. I've picked entirely the wrong ship for this demonstration because I'm intending to take you to the moon, and this was supposed to go to a planet, but we learn from our mistakes. Anyway, I'm in orbit. It's not a particularly brilliant orbit, it's rather egg-shaped, but it doesn't matter, I'm in orbit. Now for this example, I want to get to moon, and to do so, instead of using just blatant guesswork, I'm going to try and use one of the navigation nodes that are available in the game. So, there are numerous calculators and things like that that you can use online to work out exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to burn, exactly what position the planets and moons need to be in for you to take off. To be honest, I don't find that very appealing, so I've learnt through trial and error how to just, pretty much make any launch window work. It's not always the most fuel efficient, but that just adds to the challenge in some ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to guess, actually here on the periapsis, I'm going to click here and add a maneuver. Now when you do that, you are presented with these icons. The thing that confused me about these nodes to begin with is that I thought they were, let's say, a kind of autopilot. They're not. They're more like a sat-nav in a car. You can program your sat-nav, you can get it to tell you how to get to where you're going, but the sat-nav can't drive the car for you. Well, it's the same with these navigation nodes. So these here, the yellowy green ones, are arguably the most important. If I move this particular one, what I'm doing is I'm telling the equivalent of the sat-nav that this is where I want to go. As I increase this, this is telling this navigation node that at this point I will increase my velocity. Now I want to get this apoapsis estimation in line with moon. Now you can see at the moment that although it's just about a bit too far, it's just about reaching the moon's orbit, it's not in line with it, it's too high up. So that's where these two, the pink ones, come in. Here you can adjust the angular orientation of the orbit, and you can see that actually as I've done so, I've created an estimated encounter here. It's a bit messy, a bit of an odd one. If I've got this encounter, so now I can play around with these a little bit. I can change these icons, and I can see how they're affecting. I can see how they're affecting the encounter. These two blue icons, I don't know how best to describe what they do. They kind of alter the position of the oval relative to the orbital position of the body that you're heading towards. That's probably a bit of a broken way of explaining it, but trial and error can get you a long way. As well as using these icons, you can actually move the encounter. So if I put my mouse over this central circle, I can see that by adjusting the point when I burn, I can change the encounter completely. So that encounter has now shifted in such a way that if I follow this guideline, I will actually be catapulted right out of the system. Now that is a way to gain a heck of a lot of free orbital velocity, which can be extremely helpful for reaching other planets, because you're using the gravitational pull of moon to launch yourself much faster into space with minimal fuel burn. However, just for this example, I don't actually want to get catapulted out. I want to reach moon in relative safety, so I'm going to keep adjusting that. And here you can see if I burn at this point, I've got a very smooth, boring encounter. But I'm just going to change it a tiny bit more. That'll do. No, actually it won't do. A little bit more. Okay, you know what? I've got spasming hands and it's making fine adjustments very difficult. I'm just going to go with this encounter. So what happens now is on my navball down here there's a blue marker that's appeared. On top of that you've got an estimation of 771.1 meters per second. That's my delta V. That's the amount that my velocity needs to change to reach this orbital encounter. So what I'm going to do is line up roughly here. Now down at the bottom of the screen it's telling me that the node, I'm going to hit the node in 19 minutes 25 seconds, and that it's going to take around 2 minutes and 4 seconds for me to change my velocity. Now what I would normally do then is when there's 1 minute and 2 seconds to go before the node, I will burn so that half of the burn is just before the node and half of the burn is just after the node, so that you're trying to get your velocity change as accurate as possible. But at the moment, having plotted my intended route, I don't need to do anything other than reach the node. So I'm just going to speed up time a little bit. I'm not going to go too fast because if I miss the encounter then I'll just have to start again. Right, so I'm looking for the node time at half of the estimated burn time, and that's when I'll begin burning. So I'm making sure that my navball is lined up, and away we burn. Now as soon as I start burning, you see the delta V indicator begin to drop. That's because I'm beginning to match the pace of the intended velocity to reach the encounter. Obviously this will take a moment because I'm using the atomic architecture, and it's not the most powerful, but it is certainly efficient. Certainly during the bulk of the change in velocity, you need to make sure that the navball stays lined up with the blue cross. As you reach the very end of your change in velocity, the cross can sort of swing around the navball wildly. At that point, if that starts happening, it's just useful to be in map view so that you can see yourself when you've reached the encounter that you're after. But again, it's one of those things that initially completely bewildering. You think, how on earth am I going to make sense of that? And, you know, to be honest, I still use it in a haphazard way, but in this haphazard manner, I have reached each of the planets and their moons. So, you know, it's the sort of, it's almost strange calling Kerbal Space Program a game, but it is the sort of game where there's more than one way to do things. And sometimes it's fun to just experiment yourself to pick up the basics and then to see how you get on. Anyway, I'm nearly at the change in my delta V, so I'm going to throttle back a little bit because I don't want to overshoot. I'm follow the indicator next to my knuckle. And there you go. So I'm still 0.7 meters per second off of the intended velocity change, but you can see that my current orbital path pretty much exactly matches the intended one that I've set out using the manoeuvring node. If I now just delete that node, then you can see this is what's going to happen. I'm going to reach the moon, I'm going to pass 123 kilometers 123 kilometers above the surface, and then I'll be entered into a much wider orbit because of the velocity change that the moon's going to give me. If I speed up time, then I can find myself in Moon's sphere of influence. Now, at any point, you can set another node, so there's nothing stopping me, let's say, creating a node here. You can see that because of the plane that I'm moving on, it's angled differently. The icons still have the same effect, but let's just see what happens. And if I gain velocity at periapsis, it's going to have a funny old effect on my orbit. Decrease, then I'm going to end up in orbit around Moon, and I think that's actually what I'm just going to do. Now let's imagine that I want a nice, neat, circular orbit, then I can just set the node to represent that. But let's imagine that you want a particular plane around the orbital body. If I use these icons, change the plane that I'll be orbiting in. I will then need to just readjust the velocity, but you can see that I'm orbiting in a different plane than I was before. So instead of coming down at this angle, I will end up in orbit at a completely different angle. Now that will require quite a considerable change in velocity, because you're shifting not only your speed but your actual plane of orbit, and that takes quite a lot of fuel. So in a way, for this demonstration, it's a bit pointless, but hey, I can be a bit pointless sometimes. So. Okay, so I'm going to find the cross on the nav ball, and there it is. Now again, by coincidence, the burn is about 2 minutes, but this time it's just under. So half of 1 minute 58 seconds is 59 seconds. So when the node indicator at the bottom says that there's 59 seconds to go before the burn, that is when I will begin the burn, so that half of my burn is on either side of the node, which I think is fairly logical, but who knows. And off we go. So you can see that my orbit is being drawn in and closed down. But you can also just about see that as the burn continues, the apoapsis begins to level out a little bit, but the plane on which I'm orbiting begins to rotate to match the node that I'd set up. screen now, if I leave moon heading to the right... Wow, I've just had such a mental block, that's incredibly embarrassing. Okay, I need to start that again. I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen. I know I can't edit that very easily, but who gives a damn? I've completely lost my train of thought, but what I'm going to do is try and get the ship back to Kerbin. And in doing so, I'm going to use maneuver nodes. So I'm going to add a node, and I want to escape the moon. Now to do so, I'm going to head out, as we're looking at the screen, I'm going to head to the left, to put it simply. And that's because if I head to the right, I'm gaining orbital velocity relative to Kerbin, because I'm going to be going faster than the moon, effectively. Whereas if I exit to the left, which is the opposite direction to the way the moon is orbiting the planet, I'm essentially going to be losing orbital velocity relative to Kerbin. And I need to lose velocity so that I can encounter it and re-enter through the atmosphere. So that's me leaving. Just play around with that. And sometimes, because of the way the gravity works, you can end up with effects that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And actually, just by using this single burn, I'm going to be able to launch myself. I'm going to be able to launch myself in one single burn into an orbit that's actually going to take me within Kerbin's atmosphere, so I will re-enter. So again, it's time to find the cross on the nav ball. Now this time the burn is only 55 seconds, so I'm going to wait until there's 27 seconds to go before the node, and then I'll begin my burn. So there's 51 minutes before it, so I'm going to speed up time a bit. Always need to be careful when you're speeding up, ready for a node. In fact, I normally quick save the game, just in case you completely overshoot, which does happen sometimes, especially when you make it. Okay, so the burn's underway. Now, the important thing, because I've got a set target in mind, which is to re-enter Kerbin's atmosphere, I'm going to keep a close eye on my projected orbit, because it's more important to me that I reach Kerbin than I match the delta V change accurately. What I'm trying to say is, it doesn't matter to me at this point if my delta V ends up, 4 or 5 meters per second different to the estimate, because all I care about at this stage is reaching Kerbin intact. So I'm going to keep a strong eye on here. The thing that, as I see it, going back to the sat-nav analogy, is that this node is helping me get home, but I'm still in the driving seat. So as the periapsis gets closer and closer to Kerbin, keeping a close eye on it. There we go, I'll leave it at about 42 kilometers. That should 40 kilometers, that should be enough to aero brake me sufficiently to deorbit me. So I'll get rid of that node, and you can see my projected orbit will take me out of moon back to Kerbin. So I will speed up. Now that's something to bear in mind, is the manner in which Kerbal estimates physics, the patched conics way of doing it, is not always 100% accurate when you switch between spheres of influence. Now, before I left Moon's sphere of influence, my estimated periapsis was 40 kilometers, but it's now shifted to about 39. At this stage, what I'm doing here, just back and forth to Moon, it doesn't really matter, but if you're doing a longer burn, if you're trying to encounter one of the other planets, maybe Jewel or even Elu, then you need to make sure that when you switch spheres of influence, that your encounter doesn't shift, or that your periapsis doesn't shift and ruin your plans. It's something to just be mindful of. But now all I need to do at this stage is speed up time. Now notice I just cut the video slightly. The reason is simply because on the way to Kerbin I altered the orbit somewhat so that we'd re-enter during daylight, so that you can at least see the little craft in action. And there you have it, a very quick and somewhat pointless trip to Moon, in orbit around Moon, and then back to the mother planet. Simple. So there you have it. A simple, if not necessarily very good, demonstration of how to basically use the maneuver nodes.